A second approach to globalisation sees the world as a single place, but one that is riven with great divisions, and that this is occurring not in spite of, but because of greater interconnectedness. We refer to this process as polarisation. One version of this view focuses on growing inequalities in wealth and poverty. That in spite of 30 to 40 years of promises that if countries would open their markets up to free trade, that the overall standard of living for their populations will grow, what we have witnessed instead is that the affluent have accumulated an ever greater share of global wealth, and large numbers of the world's population live in conditions where they do not have adequate food, they do not have adequate water supply or sanitation supply. They have no access to any basic health or education services, and they are exposed to violence, exploitation, and catastrophe. These developments have been put down variously to the practices of international lending agencies and the ways that they may impose tight austerity measures on the budgets of states seeking development loans, so that they are unable to provide their populations with basic social services, the practices of large international corporations seeking to use the poor as a cheap source of labour, and even large agribusinesses pushing peasants off the land that they had traditionally used for their survival. Other thinkers focus on widening cultural divisions. A very famous example of this is Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis. For Huntington, a civilization is a broad cultural grouping composed of nations and ethnic groups that share a common history, a common language, quite often common religious beliefs and values. Now, there is a bit of a problem with Huntington's view of a civilization, and in particular on the various groupings that he identifies as civilizations. Nevertheless, he has been very influential in persuading people that in the aftermath of the Cold War, we're starting to witness new fault lines emerging across the globes, and in particular ones between the West and the rest of the world, united by their resentment of the West's success. Another version of the cultural division thesis has been put forward by Benjamin Barber. Barber talks about a great rift emerging between, on the one hand, McWorld, which involves a combination of McDonald's and Macintosh, representing Western consumer culture and the information and communication technologies that are threatening the distinctiveness of local places. And on the other hand, jihad, a term that he uses to refer to those nationalist and religious fundamentalist movements that seek to retain their local distinctiveness in the face of the pressures of standardisation. More recently, people have been starting to talk about divisions that are emerging within communities as a consequence of globalisation. Initially, they started to look at the way that elites in one area would disengage and disidentify with people who were physically quite close to them, and re-identify and re-engage with elites further away. So, for example, the elites in Sao Paulo in Brazil would see themselves as having more interests, values and beliefs in common with the elites in, say, Paris than they would with those who were living in the slums on the hillsides of Sao Paulo. This idea has been extended to workers who are operating within the remittance economy, where, from poor communities, families will often send someone abroad, and they will send a portion of their wages back home to that particular family. And this is said to be creating divisions within some of the poorer communities. How might this help us in thinking about education today? Well, maybe these ideas might be useful in helping to account for the growing gaps between high achievers and the low achievement of groups from disadvantaged backgrounds that seem to be occurring on almost every OECD measure of international educational performance. Maybe we can start to ask questions about whether these disadvantages are going to be redressed in an age where nearly every government everywhere is being urged to run a tight budget and to cut back on social expenditures. Perhaps, even a little bit more provocatively, maybe the Conservative proposal that we teach students about the glories of Western civilization can be understood in a strange way as an attempt to protect the distinctiveness of a local culture in the face of globalisation.